Okay, everyone, if we can, let's go ahead and think about getting started. I know what it's like now. I know what it's like now to enjoy the fellowship and the visiting, and realize that we're going to need to kind of thank you to the gentleman in the back. Good morning, everyone. I am glad to be here this morning. Thank you to Michael for the opportunity to share with you and participate in the continuation of our studies into the miracles and the parables of Jesus Christ. Normally at this time I'm over in the college age class, and it's a group that I really enjoyed working with and teaching with. But it's a blessing to be with you this morning, and I'm thankful for this opportunity. We are going to look at a continuation of miracles and parables, and specifically today we're going to be looking at 5 examples, 5 restorations to life that occurred with the life of Christ. There's 5 of them, and in 32 minutes I can probably adequately hopefully cover 3. The 5 include raising the widow's son, Jairus' daughter, raising Jairus' daughter, the resurrection of Lazarus, and then of course Jesus' resurrection, and a 5th one that occurred following Jesus' death at the time of Jesus' resurrection, where we had the tombs were open and bodies were raised and entered into the city. Matthew's chapter 27 is the only one that really talks about that in any detail. We really don't know a lot about what happened afterwards. That's the 5th one. We'll probably not cover that this morning. And because we could probably spend this class period and next week and the week after talking about the resurrection of Jesus, I've chosen the first 3 to focus our time on this morning. And we'll be looking at the first 3 examples of that. And if you would, in preparation for that, let's open our Bibles to Luke chapter 7. And we will be starting in verse 11. And we're going to talk about raising of the widow's son, first of all. Resurrections are associated with the life of Christ, are recorded to assure us that when we die, that our God has the power to raise us to life again. So we have these as examples for us to strengthen our faith. Yet there were some then, as there are now, that deny the resurrection of Christ. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 12, Paul tells us that there were some of the new Christian converts that struggled with the idea that Christ had been raised from the dead. In verse 16 of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul reminds them, these Christians that had these questions or concerns, that if there's no resurrection of the dead, then Christ wasn't raised from the dead. And then in verse 19, Paul says that if there's no resurrection of the dead, then if we have hoped in Christ in this life only, we are of all men most to be pitied. So the resurrection is essential to our faith. The resurrection is essential to who we are and what we believe. And without that, it would be devastating to our beliefs. It would leave us essentially void of any hope. So when we look at the first example of restoration to life, we have a raising of the widow's son. And this is found only in Luke chapter 7. The first 10 verses of Luke 7, we have Jesus healing the centurion's servant. And then we come to verse 11. So this miracle occurred in the first year of Jesus' earthly ministry. It took place in the city of Nain, at the gate of the city of Nain. Now, Nain is a small village located on the hills of Galilee. Jesus is traveling from Capernaum back to the city of Nain with his disciples and the multitude that seemed to follow him wherever he went. And they approached the city of Nain, and as he approaches the gate, he sees this funeral procession that's leaving the city, carrying this widow's son. And the Bible tells us in Luke chapter 13 that Jesus felt compassion for this woman who had just lost her son. Now, a widow is someone, especially during the first century here, during this time, is someone who's considered destitute. This woman had just lost her husband, or had lost her husband. She suffered that tragedy, but she had a son, and the son was going to be there to help and support and encourage and provide and do all the things that sons were expected to do. And then the widow suffers a second tragedy. She loses her son. And by losing her son, she was really left with essentially nothing, and her future offered very little hope. So the Lord is traveling from Capernaum through the city of Nain, and he encounters this widow. He has compassion for her. Now, our Lord having compassion for the widow or for us today shouldn't surprise any of us. James tells us in James chapter 5, verse 11, that the Lord was full of compassion. The Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. And when we look at Matthew, chapter 7 and verse 12, we read the golden rule, the Christian principles that we all strive to live by. And having sympathy, empathy, and compassion for someone is living in a Christ-like manner. So it shouldn't surprise us that Jesus felt compassion for her and says to her, "Woman, do not weep." In verse 14, Luke tells us that Jesus comes up, touches the side of the coffin, and the coffin bearers, they come to a halt. Now the word soros, S-O-R-O-S, is sometimes translated coffin. Sometimes it's translated like an open stretcher. And in fact, those of you that are reading from the King James Version probably have the word bier, B-I-E-R, rather than coffin in your text. There are some that believe that Jews seldom used coffins back at this particular time, so maybe it was more of an open stretcher. But whatever it was, Jesus touches this open stretcher, this open coffin. And in verse 14, we read that Jesus then spoke to the dead man and said to him, "Young man, I say to you, arise." Verse 15 tells us that the young man immediately sat up and began to speak, and that Jesus delivered him over to his mother. Now, Michael this morning used the pause button. I'm going to ask us if we would just a step back. I don't know about you, but I can't help but think and wonder at times, and I didn't use the word speculate because I don't want to take from or add to anything that the Word of God provides to us, but there had to have been some emotion in all of this. So this woman has lost her husband, lost her son, she's destitute, and Jesus, feeling compassion, has walked up, touched the stretcher, the open coffin, and her son sits up, and in verse 15 says he begins to speak, and he's delivered over to his mother. There had to have been tears, there had to have been hugs, there had to have been a lot of emotion flowing from both the son and the mother. And you have to kind of think that Jesus had maybe a smile on his face. We know that he had emotions. John 11, verse 35 tells us that he wept. He wept for Lazarus. So surely joy was an emotion that Jesus possessed as well, even though we don't see it written of quite a bit. But that had to have taken place. And so this young man is delivered back to his mother. Verse 16 tells us that the disciples, they've just seen Jesus restore or heal the centurion's slave. So they were witness to that miracle, the miracle of healing. But Jesus has stepped it up a notch. Now he's raised this widow's son from the dead. So fear grips the disciples, and they began glorifying God. Some were saying that a great prophet has arisen among us. Others were saying that God had visited his people. All that's found in verse 16. But the fact of the matter is that a significant miracle had taken place, this being the first miracle performed by Jesus. And this report, as Luke tells us in verse 17, went out among all over Judea and all throughout the surrounding district. We've learned, as I've said, that this was the first person Jesus raised from the dead. This was an extension of the healings that Jesus had been performing already. We also know that some of the apostles, noticeably Peter and Paul, were also had the ability to raise people from the dead. Peter raised Tabitha or Dorcas from the dead in Acts chapter 9, and then Paul raised Eutychus from the dead in Acts chapter 20. Eutychus was the young man who was sitting in a third-story window, fell asleep, fell to his death, and Paul, of course, raised him from the dead. So, these miracles are being done to, as Michael mentioned this morning, to not only encourage, but to bolster faith and to bolster belief and to encourage one another to believe in the Son of God. So restoration number one was the widow's son. The second example that we have of Jesus restoring someone to life can be found in the raising of Jairus' daughter. This particular account is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but once again, I'd like to focus primarily on the book of Luke. And if you would, just turn one chapter. Let's go look at Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8 is really a powerful chapter in that it's filled with examples of God's message, miracles of healing, and then, of course, a restoration of life starting at verse 40. But in Luke chapter 8, we start off with the parable of the sower and the seed, followed by the parable of the lamp, followed by the miracle of Jesus calming the water, the seas, the waves. And then after that, we had the miracle of the healing of the Gerasene demoniac. And then we finally make it to verse 40. In all of these miracles and restoration of life, the key word found in many of these is belief and faith. The Greek word pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S, is sometimes translated belief and sometimes translated faith. One might ask, why was faith being emphasized so much during many of these miraculous events? And the answer to that, of course, is that the miracles also produced faith, as John tells us in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Jesus had reached a crucial point in his ministry. He knew that his time left on earth was down to just a matter of months, and he needed to leave behind a strong core of believers. So with many of the miracles, many of the restorations to life, the resurrections, Jesus urged the people to believe. And that brings us to Jairus. Now, in verse 41, Luke tells us that Jairus was the ruler of the synagogue. What does it mean to be the ruler of the synagogue? To be the ruler of the synagogue meant that you were in charge. You were the highest-ranking Jewish official. In this case, it was in the city of Capernaum. And Jairus was responsible for all the activities that took place in that synagogue. And despite his high position, despite the prestige that he had within the community and how he was looked up upon, in spite of all of that, or despite of all of that, Jairus humbles himself and comes bowing down before Jesus. We can see that in Luke chapter 8, verse 41. So in spite of his position, he bows down, he prostrates himself before Jesus. Now, both Mark and Luke say that he fell at Jesus' feet. Matthew, in Matthew 9:18, says he bowed down before Jesus. Whether he bowed down or whether he fell to the ground, prostrated himself, I don't see a contradiction there. What I see is humility. And we had a man of prestige that lowered himself, humbled himself to the point to where he was willing to turn everything over just so that Jesus might come to his home and heal his daughter. The original word for bowing down suggests, as I said, that he prostrated himself, which means he either kissed Jesus' feet, maybe the hem of his garment, or possibly the ground in front of him. And also in verse 41, we see the fact that Jairus implored him. New American Standard has the word implored. I'm not sure what the other translations may have, but hitting the pause button again and stepping back, I would ask myself, and maybe we could ask each other, how would you respond? What would be your response if the only hope, the only possibility that your daughter or family member had would be that Jesus would come to your home and heal them? Would you implore? Would you plead? Would you beg? I can see myself doing all of the above as a father of 3 children. If my daughter was sick to the point of death, and if I had heard about this man Jesus doing all these miracles, I would have done whatever it took, regardless of what people thought. So that's the situation that Jairus found himself in. Luke tells us in verse 42 that this was a young girl. She was 12 years old. Luke tells us that this was the only daughter of Jairus. Well, as I mentioned, my wife and I have 3 children that we're very proud of. Our youngest is our daughter. So yes, I'm the father of a daughter, but doesn't necessarily mean that's my only child. We just know that this was his only child and his only daughter. We don't know if he had other children. And we also know and learn in verse 42 that she was dying. Now, a little bit of controversy here. Some like to throw their hands up in the air and say, contradiction. There's evidence, there's proof that, this is flawed. Matthew, in chapter 9, verse 18, says that Jairus said that his daughter had died. Both Mark and Luke say that she was either at the point of death or near death, that she had not died yet. One of the commentators said regarding Matthew's account that this may very well have been probably how a grieving father might have approached it. Matthew's account kind of reflected that. They say that it's almost like, Matthew approached Jesus and said, my daughter, she's home, she's almost sick, and if we don't hurry up and get there, she's going to be dead, so we really need to go. So I don't necessarily see a contradiction here. I think all 3 accounts indicate that this 12-year-old girl was gravely ill to near the point of death, and that we need to hustle along to get there and be there for her. Now, in the middle of all of this, something happens that's kind of special, spectacular. It's miraculous. And that is that as they're preparing, I guess, to go to Jairus' house, a woman who has had an issue of blood for 12 years comes up, touches the hem of Jesus' garment, and she's healed. So Jairus is there. Maybe he's still prostrated on the ground, and he witnesses Jesus healing another person. This poor soul had been putting up with this for 12 years, and Jesus is able to heal her of that affliction, restore her health, and everybody's marveling at that. And Jairus is like, we really need to get going. I left my daughter at the house, and she was so close to being dead. And this is what the textbooks call a parenthetical miracle, a miracle within a miracle, but it still kind of caused a little bit of a delay. And me being me, I would be a little bit impatient. I'm ready to go. We need to go. All right? And in the middle of all of that, guess what happens? The kick in the stomach shows up. A messenger comes from Jairus' home and says, your daughter's died. Don't bother the teacher any longer. And I'm thinking to myself, how much can a person take? And as I'm reading this, and granted, all of that emotion is not necessarily in the Bible here, but you can almost sense it. You can almost feel it. So we have a situation here where now we know that the young girl has passed. Jairus' frustration by the delay turns to despair. In verse 49, we're going to bypass the the woman that was healed. That's a topic that someone else will address at a later time. But now we have in verse 49 and 50, and in verse 50 especially, Christ is aware of this. Christ sees the pain and the agony that Jairus is going through, recognizes his despondency, and says to him, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe. Only believe, and she will be made well." That's Luke chapter 8, verse 50. Wow, all I need to do is believe, and my daughter's going to be made well. Maybe he didn't hear that she had just died. So, you have to kind of wonder about the dynamics and everything that's taking place, but kind of keep in mind, we're going to come back to Luke 8, verse 50 in just a second. So, Jesus and the multitude and Jairus, they travel back to Jairus' home, and when they arrive at Jairus' home, they see this big commotion going on. The crowd is noisy. You got people playing flutes, you got women, you got people wailing and weeping and crying and so forth, all that's going on. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe this picture. It's somewhat chaotic even in verse 52 of Luke. The resources tell us that a family's social position was indicated by the number of professional mourners that you could hire. Professional mourners that you could hire or that you could afford to hire, and the amount of noise that they can make at your funeral, at somebody's funeral. It's even said that even the poor were expected to have at least one wailing woman. I found that interesting. So when Jesus arrives, he takes Jairus and his wife, the parents. He takes Peter, James, and John. Michael this morning talked about this inner circle of apostles. He takes them into the house where this 12-year-old girl is lying dead. We know that this, as Michael said this morning, these three apostles, Peter, James, and Paul, were also present at the Transfiguration and then in the Garden of Gethsemane. So Jesus tells the mourners to stop their weeping. This is in verses 52 and 53. And that the girl is not dead, that she's asleep. Now, sleep is a common euphemism for death, and we see that a little bit later in our study of Lazarus. So they transition from weeping and crying and wailing and flute playing to laughing and possibly mocking Jesus. What do you mean that she's asleep? We know this young lady, she's dead, she's passed away. So Jesus takes the girl by the hand and says to her, and I'm not a Greek scholar and I don't claim to know how to necessarily pronounce this, but T-A-L-I-T-H-A, Talitha Kumi, C-U-M-I, which is Aramaic expression for child, arise. That's in verse 54. Luke tells us that her spirit returned, which leaves no doubt that this young lady had died. She gets up immediately, begins to walk. We find that in Mark chapter 5, verse 42. Luke doesn't include that, but Luke does say that immediately as she gets up, Jesus says to give her something to eat, and that's in verse 55. Once again, pressing the pause button, you have to put yourself in the place of Jairus and his wife. What would Rose and I do if we had a daughter that had died and Jesus had brought her back and she's restored to life? She gets up, she walks over to us, runs to us possibly. We're going to hug her, we're going to kiss her, there's going to be tears, all kinds of emotion. All that is going to take place. And once again, the compassion, the sympathy, the empathy that Jesus showed is something that he showed in the first century, but he still shows to us today. Verse 56 of Luke 8 says that the parents were amazed. That's all we really know, is that they were amazed. But my heart of hearts, I have to kind of think that there was probably more than just amazement. So the parents are amazed, but what did the Pharisees do? The Pharisees, the animosity between Jesus and them had been growing, and many of them went back and told the Jews in Jerusalem what was taking place. Jesus gives the parents strict orders not to tell anybody about that, but Matthew in chapter 9, verse 26 tells us that the word of this event, this miraculous restoration to life, spread throughout all the region and Judea. And you kind of think that's probably a natural thing that was going to happen. Someone might ask, and that's why I asked you to remember we were going to come back to verse 50. If anyone asked Jairus, "Do you believe?" which is what Jesus had said to him, "Only believe and your daughter will be healed." If somebody had asked Jairus, "Do you believe?" what do you think his answer might have been? What would my answer have been? My daughter has just been raised from the dead. My wife and I are holding her. And my response would have been, "Yes, I believe. Yes, I believe." And I can't imagine Jairus not feeling anything but that. You know, Michael this morning talked about the man whose son was demon-possessed. And Jesus asked him only to believe. And his response, the boy's father cried out, "I do believe, help my unbelief." You know, maybe that might have been included in Jairus' answer as well. But I can't imagine a more significant event that would impart faith and belief in an individual than to have their child restored to life. The last example that we have that we're going to be able to cover this morning is the resurrection of Lazarus. And it's one that we've talked about probably most frequently, that in the resurrection of Christ himself. But this was one of the more dramatic representations of restoration to life, simply because of how Lazarus emerged from the tomb, how he was still wrapped in burial clothes and garments, and how Jesus called him by name from the tomb. That was fairly dramatic, and there was a multitude of people there to see that. There was probably no family closer to Jesus than Lazarus and Mary and Martha. Their message to Jesus is interesting. They send a message to Jesus, and by the way, we're in John chapter 11. I apologize. John chapter 11, the whole chapter is dedicated to the resurrection of Lazarus and the consequences that came afterwards. But in verse 3, the Lord gets a message from Mary and Martha and says, "Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick." Now, there's a lot of things that we don't know regarding things that transpired at this period of time. There's a lot of things that we do know. Some of the things that we don't know is we don't know why the message was so vague. If Lazarus was critically ill, gravely ill, maybe the message would have reflected a little more gravity to it than it did. We don't really know what the sickness was that Lazarus was suffering from. Have you ever wondered what it was that had him near or to the point of death and eventually took his life? I've kind of wondered, but I think if it was significant, the Lord would have told us, so I'm not worried about it. And then one of the things, and I try to avoid a lot of the speculation, but some of the commentaries want to kind of delve into why there was a delay, because once Jesus got the message, he stayed 2 days longer in his location before he traveled back to Bethany, where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. But one thing we do know, there are several things that we do know. First of all, verse 5 tells us that Jesus loved Lazarus and loved Mary and Martha. We also know that Lazarus had been dead 4 days by the time Jesus got back. There was no doubt at all that Lazarus had passed away. And the third thing we know, and Jesus says this himself, and that is that the sickness was not going to end in the death of Lazarus, that he knew that Lazarus would be raised, and he knew that by resurrecting Lazarus, that God would be glorified and the Son of God would be glorified as well. And that was the ultimate result. That was the tragedy of Lazarus' death brought about beyond any reasonable doubt that Jesus was his son. So I'm going to fast forward in the minute or two that we have left. towards the bottom here, we have an exchange between between Martha and Jesus. There is a bold assertion by Jesus that he's the resurrection and the life. There's a believing affirmation by Martha where she says, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. Mary finally arrives in verse 32, and he sees the anguish on Mary and Martha's face. Shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35, we read that Jesus wept. Once again, this is the emotion. This is the compassionate side of Christ that should surprise none of us and should give us all hope. At the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus commands a stone to be rolled back. Verse 39, Martha reminds Jesus that her brother had been dead 4 days, the body probably was decaying, and that there might be an odor, to which Jesus responds to Martha, did I not say to you that if you believe, that you'll see the glory of God? And that's in verse 40. And then Jesus does something. He prays. He prays out loud to God in front of all the people. And then he calls out Lazarus by name in verses 41 and 42. Called out Lazarus by name. I want to share with you from one of the commentaries. J.W. McGarvey, a very notable writer of commentaries, wrote that it has been happily said that he called Lazarus by name, lest all the dead should rise. And that, I couldn't help but have a smile on my face. He called Lazarus by name just so that there was no confusion, and all the others that had fallen asleep, all the other believers that had passed away, hadn't arisen as well. That's McGarvey's take on it, but I just thought that, it just kind of puts in perspective, the power that Christ had, the power that God has over death, and the hope that we have through his Son. I appreciate your patience, and thank you for being here this morning, and have a good day.